Very good. I'm sorry I'm a bit late. Well, I think I was late anyway, wasn't I?
No problem at all. I was just about to apologize myself in case you'd been sort of waiting and unable to get into the call.
No, the waiting room's a weird feature, isn't it? But it's probably a good idea.
I'm sure it was.
What is strange about Zoom is the incredibly high standards of punctuality, by which I mean, if you have a physical meeting, you just allow for the fact that it might start 15 or 20 minutes late. But if you have a Zoom call and nothing kicks in after 5 minutes, you start to panic.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it's a bit of a relief if you've scheduled too many meetings, but then you sort of get paranoid that the person's forgot. But in any case, I'm very glad that we're both here, and thank you very much for joining us on the Greatest Music of All Time podcast. I wanted to start by asking you, and I want to move away from music at different points in the episode, as we often do when we have guests from other areas of life. But I wanted to start by asking a music-related question, which is, how big a role does music play in your life?
It's probably fair to say since lockdown, more than ever. It played a huge role in my life, and I have to confess this to an extent, a huge role in my life up until my 30s. And it was also revived, actually, by the discovery of internet downloads and so forth, and Spotify, which has made discovery much, much easier. And so it's ebbed and flowed a little bit. But it's also very strange. It would play a much bigger part in my life, I think. The strangest thing I have is I have 19-year-old children who turn the volume down. Now, they claim I'm deaf, but the idea of children turning the volume down on their parents' music would have seemed absurd to me when I was 20 or 15 or whatever, because it was always the other way around. And the other thing is, it's very difficult when you're in a family of 4 to listen with headphones on, which I would do by temperament, because I like the immersion of listening over headphones, just as I wear headphones for Zoom calls, as you are doing, because it displaces you more effectively, I think, if you wear headphones than if you listen to anything on a speaker. But
true.
It's incredibly difficult to listen to music with headphones on for more than about 10 minutes before someone comes and asks you a question without really respecting the fact that you're wearing headphones. Is this just me who grumbles about this? It may be just me, but
you need to go on a walk. You need to go on a walk and go and get a coffee or something. It's a lockdown ritual of mine. I mean, this shows how dire the times that we're living in are. But to go to Shell down the road, because I'm in the countryside, go to Shell, get a Costa, and sit and listen to music for 25 minutes or so.
Where are you in the countryside?
I'm in Northamptonshire.
Oh, fantastic! So you're in an office at the moment, are you, or are you in a home studio?
Yes. No, I'm in an office. I go into the office twice a week to do podcasts, just to make sure the internet's all right, because I've tried from home and it's not very good, and it's just painful when the internet doesn't work on a Zoom.
I thought either you're in an office or you've got a remarkably minimalist taste in home decor. So yeah, I'm glad to know it's. Yeah.
Thankfully, this is not my taste in home decor. It would be pretty dire. Although, people more and more I see backgrounds, and I do think, God, people have lost. And this is definitely not something you're a victim of, but I see backgrounds, and I sort of think, God, people don't really keep many possessions, don't have photo frames, don't have sort of things that make a house and a room warmer.
No. They may be artificial backgrounds. Sometimes they are. They tend to be a bit minimalist.
Who are some of the bands, artists?
I'm going to give a first plug. About a third of my listening is classical, which I don't know if you're used to on the show.
No, sometimes.
I'm a big fan of Primephonic, which is kind of Spotify for classical music, because the problem with Spotify, if you listen to classical music, is what you might call the choice architecture or the search structure doesn't really work with, say, 3-part classical works. In fact, you can have some famous disasters searching for classical music on Spotify, and it'll probably get better. But Primephonic's very good, also very high quality audio. And I've made discoveries through it, as you do with Spotify, particularly sort of rediscovered Haydn. I mean, not a particularly obscure composer, but I think a composer who suffers from having written so much stuff, having been so prolific, that you can almost end up undervalued because nobody really knows where to start. And so that's been a big discovery. I've always been an absolute Bach devotee. And actually the whole family as well. JC I'm a particular fan of, I mean disproportionately so, as well as JS. And anything, actually quite a lot of Baroque. Then I have the kind of musical tastes which are fairly eclectic, but I have to admit hopelessly old-fashioned. I've fallen victim to that problem, which I think a lot of people do, particularly before you have a family, when your children start reintroducing you to more contemporary music. Although my children's tastes are, by the way, similarly bizarre and eclectic, in that they routinely listen to things, and when I say I know what this is and I recognize it, they say, "How do you know this song?" And I go, "Because it's from 1979." And they seem completely thrown by this. Now, this strikes me as a slightly weird phenomenon, which is probably a product of two things. So the fact that in other words, my kids don't disproportionately listen to contemporary music. One of them is a sort of massive fan of quite a lot of bands from the 70s. One of them's a massive Smiths fan, for God's sake. Okay. And they'll also listen to a huge amount of. So part of it, I suspect, is that you can't actually tell what's contemporary or not, because in something like 1968, recording production values reached a point where, if you listen to, let's say, I always think the production values on the Beatles are quite bad. Am I alone in this?
Well, I think that was still not at the stage where production had reached its
you're
point.
right, it probably was. But on the other hand, the Stones have survived. I don't listen to Stones records and go, "God, this sounds really old."
Well, the Stones made a lot of their great work in the 70s.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So there must have been this point in 1970 where, obviously, if you're listening to in the 1960s to 1930s dance bands, it was a 78 record and there was a massive amount of crackle in the background, and you were conscious of the fact that this is old simply because of all the cues on the sound. So that's one thing. The second thing is, of course, because of the nature of the music industry and how music is bought and streamed and shared, and also how it's sampled. Particularly I think because of sampling as well, I don't think my kids have a particular sense of musical chronology in the way that probably my generation did. But you know much more about this than me. I'd love to know your opinions on it. You're probably right that it might have been around 1970 that things finally reached a level of kind of fidelity.
Well, I think they continued evolving till the 80s, but definitely from 80s on, there's been nothing really that new done. I guess it's been easier for people to do things with laptops, but in terms of actually any sounds in pop that sound that new, I mean, obviously hip hop and things like that came really to the fore from the 90s, late 80s, 90s was when it started getting big. So you've seen a lot more of that, but that's not sonics. That's not like a new drum sound or a new synth sound. It was the 80s where synths were sort of like the last thing, synths and drum machines. So
the interesting thing was there seemed to be quite a few instances where bands had just acquired a new bit of kit. And the first thing, I know Blue Monday is famous for this, isn't it? They just bought this thing effectively and were dicking around with it. I've got a vague memory that ABBA's The Day Before You Came, which I always think is one of the great pop songs of all time. I've got a vague memory that was similar, that they just bought some piece of Moog equipment for their shed on an island in the Stockholm archipelago and, were kind of, again, messing around with it. And it's worth knowing, by the way, that this relationship between technology and music is much, much older than I realized. I always joke that I always think it was sad that the piano replaced the harpsichord. because the harpsichord had a mixture of tune and rhythm, which the piano to some extent lost. I don't know. I mean, I probably come across as an appalling Luddite, but I'm not altogether happy that the harpsichord disappeared and got replaced by the piano. But if you go back apparently to sort of 1730, if you were somewhere in sort of North Germany and your church organ broke, the guy you called on to repair the organ was J.S. Bach, because he wasn't just a fantastic composer. He was apparently the guy with the best technical understanding of organ. Now, if you think about it, of course, a church organ was probably the single most important the most complex piece of technology on the planet, apart from some clocks, I guess. Those were about the only really, really complex pieces of equipment. Navigation and church music were the two kind of absolute sort of Silicon Valley areas of their time. And it was J.S. Bach who came and sorted out your diapason tube or whatever it is. I never know how to pronounce that. And so that always fascinated me to realize that he was both technologist and composer.
That is fascinating. I didn't actually know that at all.
I hope I'm right. I read it in a book by Paul Johnson, and he's pretty much right on everything. But it surprised me. I never realized that, because he's so much remembered as a composer. I don't think anybody, because nobody really remembers great organ repair people of the 1720s,
Yeah.
But that always interests me as well. And then I'm really fascinated by reading. The other thing that fascinates me from an advertising point of view about music is songs and tunes that are effectively the same. So there's a whole thing on Pachelbel's canon. There's a whole blog post on the fact that Pachelbel's canon is effectively, which is the only famous thing. I mean, he was he was a kind of contemporary of Bach, I think, if I got that right, more or less. And he's only really famous for this canon, although he was considered, on a par with Bach. I think not quite on a par, but I mean, kind of, he was kind of equivalently eminent at the time. And there are about, 10 pieces of music, very famous pieces of music, that effectively reuse exactly the same note structure. I'm always really, really interested in that, because it's interesting in terms of advertising, in the sense that there are quite a few ads which, if you dig down enough, they're actually the same ad. You could say that Heineken and Hamlet from, the 1970s were, pretty similar variations on a theme. And yet the interesting thing is people never notice. There's a famous thing by Mika, which is, I can't remember, one of those, the guy, he's kind of a music school graduate, and that uses a piece of music. And I had this vague inkling that there was something familiar about it. And I think it uses a bit of music from Schubert or something. It uses the same thing. And it always fascinates me, the fact that essentially you're repackaging things in often unrecognizable forms. I mean, this is what's so fascinating. True. I mean, legal music stuff strikes me as fascinating, where you get the case, is My Sweet Lord stolen from One Fine Day, I think it is, isn't it? Yeah. There was a legal case with George Harrison involving this. Yeah, there was. And you've had another one which argues that the Stairway to Heaven was actually from somewhere else. I know for sure that the Star Wars march is actually on an Al Bowley tune called My Woman, from 1935. So if you listen to this album, this is another one you won't expect. A very big fan of Al Bowley as the first of the crooners. It's a Lebanese Greek guy who was both in the UK and the United States. Probably one of the first vocalists to achieve kind of rock star status back in the 30s. But there's a song My Woman, which you can find on Spotify, and right in the background, clear as day, you have the Star Wars march. And that fascinates me, the extent to which, of course, there is only at one level, there's only so much you can do.
Yeah, that's very
But
true.
at another level, you can essentially continually reinvent, repackage. It just fascinates me. And obviously music fascinates me, along with humor and comedy, because it's, essentially, they're two things which obviously have huge evolutionary value for us, for reasons we still don't fully understand. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there are people with no sense of humor. I mean, it's fair. There's almost nobody who's amusical. there are Milton Friedman, and I think I've got this right, Che Guevara, I think were totally amusical to a point where they couldn't really tell the difference between music and random noise. Which,
Really?
given Friedmanite economics, is kind of interesting, I suppose, as a sideline. But when you think about how strange that must be, I mean, I need to research it a bit more, but I'm fairly sure there is this rare condition called amusia, where you know, just as there are people who genuinely don't get jokes. I came across one economist who said he didn't understand the point of graphs. Okay, now this is presumably someone who's so numerate in terms of their focus that he says, why don't you just present a chart of numbers? Why do you need to put it on a graph? And, you know, I mean, 99% of people will go, well, you can see things on graphs. Surely you could look at a graph
more clearly.
But to this guy, he said, I just don't understand the point. You can just give me the data. But being amusical must be really, really strange. I mean, there are a lot of people who are tone deaf. You know, I'm not brilliant myself.
But they still appreciate music.
But they can hugely appreciate music, even if they can't sing it. But at the same time, you know, that ability not really to be able to distinguish between what's musical and what's a random noise must be vanishingly rare, unless there are a lot of people who are keeping it secret and just pretending to go to gigs. I don't know.
So, as somebody who's, you know, I would say an expert on marketing, is there in terms of music, is there a marketing campaign or just simply a way in which a musical venture, a band, an artist has been marketed, either recently or just in general, that comes to mind that you think is particularly original?
That's really interesting. The marketing of music, I don't know so much about, although it is fascinating, by the way, to see how many great bands and acts were either the product of a lucky break or a chance meeting. You know, that forever fascinates me. You know, the fact that I think, if I'm right, Keith Richards and Mick actually had gardens which were diagonally adjacent as kids, but there was a bit of an age gap between them, and they happened to meet again on a train from Dartford, and one of them was carrying a load of original blues records.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a famous case, isn't there? Roxy Music kind of got started by a chance meeting on the Tube somehow. I can never remember how that happened. And that always fascinates me. I mean, that you know, when you think about what extraordinary serendipity is involved. Because I always argue, the reason this is relevant to marketing is I always argue that, look, a large part of advertising is probably, how would I describe it? It's much more probabilistic than we like to think. We like to think of lots of consumers there being even, and then we inject some advertising into all of them, and all of them become equally more predisposed to buy a product, okay? And I suspect in reality it doesn't work like that at all. You know, that what happens is that someone's heard of the product and they talk to a guy, and then someone mentions it on their radio show. And I think fame is actually much more probabilistic and much more, what would you call, sort of stochastic. And we tend to think of it as if it's kind of deterministic and even. And actually, I think a lot of fame, it really fascinates me, the role that luck plays. Supposedly Super Dry, this is one case of just total luck. Super Dry which is not Japanese, right? Okay, it's from Cheltenham. I used to joke and say, you know, like bukkake, we think it's Japanese, but it actually originated in Cheltenham. That is not true of bukkake. I will spare the people of that eminently respectable Cotswold town that accusation. But no, Super Dry did originate in Cheltenham, and he was selling these things from some sort of market store, and then David Beckham happened to end up wearing one.
Really?
And that always does freak me out. I had a friend the guy you really should interview about behavioral science and music is a guy called Nick Southgate. And he always believed, for example, that there was a band called the Pretty Things who should have been as big as the Beatles, but they got their timing slightly wrong. Are you aware of these people? He used to write for an incredibly niche magazine called The Wire.
I feel like I've heard that name, but maybe not. Maybe I think I'm just thinking of some more recent band who was called Dirty Pretty Things.
Ah, right, that might be different. Yeah.
Yeah, it will be different. I haven't
But
heard of Pretty
the
Things.
Pretty Things were sometime in the, I think, they produced a kind of extraordinary and innovative album, but it happened to come out like 6 weeks after Pet Sounds or whatever it was, and so ended up falling into obscurity. So he's one of these people who always wants to look at the parallel universe theory of musical outcomes. Um, it is weird because it's such a, what else would I say? Marketing of bands. There's some very nice stories from advertising, by the way, where people have been kind of rescued because BBH of the 1980s and 90s was very, very good at raiding the back catalogue, and particularly the Levi's campaign. Essentially was almost taste forming in terms of music, and I'm fairly sure it kind of rescued Percy Sledge in his later years, because suddenly this song, which probably everybody had heard once but not enough, I can't remember, but I think someone had to go and find him and say, basically he was down by some river fishing and some guy comes and finally tracks him down and says, Percy, you're #1 in the UK. What the hell? I also think that this is the saddest thing, which is he never made it, but a guy, Neil French, who was the creative director of Ogilvy, simply asked all of us as kind of creative directors of Ogilvy agencies, what are your 20 favorite moments from the whole of film history? See, it might have been, I think he might have cut them down to your 10 favorites or your whatever. And what he was intending to do was, first of all, to make the point that about 90% of them were accompanied by music. That somehow, music contributes by emotional context setting. It enormously contributes to our enjoyment of films. And I think that the advertising industry, one of the failings it's undoubtedly fallen into, is the importance of music and jingles, which are, I've seen some recent research, which are proven, sonic identity, okay, is proven to be an incredibly valuable part of a brand's iconography, to use a slightly fatuous phrase, but an incredibly important brand property in terms of value, in terms of recognition, in terms of creating familiarity and reassurance. And yet it isn't investigated nearly as much as the verbal or visual side. So those brands, you can probably remember Intel Inside, British Airways with Delib, those brands that are actually associated with a piece of music or even just a jingle, basically enjoy a kind of superpower. And you'd think that the ad industry would look for this more. But the weird thing is, because jingles kind of went out of fashion, okay, and because it was seen as a kind of, I can remember somebody at Ogilvy getting kicked out of their flat because they were staying in a company flat for a few weeks to make room for a jingle writer who was over from Los Angeles in about 1989. Now, I can't envisage that happening now.
Why did they go out of fashion?
Just because in a way, with fashion, it was seen as old-fashioned. There were, there was a kind of Nike kind of school, not that they don't use music, but there was a kind of school of well, first of all, there was probably a school of kind of highfalutin campaign driving advertising. It's sometimes called sort of purpose-led advertising. For whatever reason, the mode has chosen to communicate those kind of things, and it may be that the introduction of planning, or the something to do with the time scale of the way advertising is produced, or the path dependency of the way advertising is produced, or just the haste, was no longer conducive to building in really valuable sonic auditory properties. But if you think about it, I don't know if you're probably too young to remember the Shaken Vac, okay?
I don't remember.
but even okay, you do the shake and back and put the freshness back. Do the shake and back and put the freshness back. If your carpet smells good, your room does too. So every time you shake and vac, this is what you do. Repeat. Okay. Now, I'm not suggesting it's fucking Shakespeare, nor was it any good musically. I think even the composer would admit that. But I can remember, I can't remember the first line of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, Richard Dawkins couldn't even remember the subtitle of The Origin of Species, right? So, and yet most people in Britain of my age will immediately recognize that song.
That's interesting.
And it's interesting to me also because there are properties of songs which simple repetition makes them work.
Yeah.
I have a very, very strong aversion. I absolutely hate the song Happy Birthday to You, to a point where if the social obligation isn't that strong, I leave the room rather than hear it sung, because it's a horrible dirge. It's absolutely appalling. And yet simple
I think
repetition.
the Stevie Wonder version's even worse, to be honest.
Yes, it is, isn't it? You're absolutely right. Yeah, that is actually. Yeah,
He should just sing he should sing just Happy Birthday rather than that.
Even Marilyn Monroe only took it to the the borderline level of tolerance, didn't she? So if it takes Marilyn Monroe to make your song, broadly speaking, just about watchable, if nothing else, okay, then you're probably not onto a winner. But nonetheless, simple repetition, as with Christmas songs, which I guess are kind of absolute gold mine to the people. If you can produce one of those 15 Christmas songs, you're kind of minted.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting to me. I mean, that just fascinates me. The other thing that fascinates me is the very small proportion of songs where there's no repetition required, where I can now I'm not contemporary enough to do this on anything recent, but I can remember a few occasions where I just saw a song and thought, shit, that's amazing. And some of them are totally obscure, but most of them, for example, Bohemian Rhapsody, I saw it for the first time on TV with that incredible video. Ironically, it was actually composed and recorded about 3 miles from where I lived, at Rockfield Studios, you see. So it was one of those.
Yeah.
They've still got the original piano. So I don't know why they didn't flog that, because that must be worth $500,000, I would have thought. But anyway, the interesting thing is that there are a few others. I mentioned the ABBA song "The Day Before You Came," absolutely just haunting, extraordinary. And there are about 4 or 5 of these songs which hit me absolutely. There's a bit of Eminem did it. I'm getting a tiny bit more contemporary, though not much. A few of those songs are kind of stop the car songs. They used to have, there was an ad campaign for a South African radio station, which was brilliant, which just showed, it was a particular music station, and it just showed people kind of reversing out of tunnels or arriving home and then not getting out of the car for 2 minutes. You know what I mean? That particular song where, in other words, you just have to listen to it.
Yeah.
I suppose I've had that experience, 10, 20 times in my life. And that strikes me as a really, really remarkable achievement to do that, to produce something which doesn't require any repetition at all. You just go, shit, this is amazing. What is it?
Yeah. Yeah, that happens to me every now and again. Yeah, for sure. And I guess it's different songs for different people that elicit that kind of reaction.
What would be your latest one? I'd love
10 out of 10.
Because the rarity thing is, with films, I have the same criterion, which is that there's a very particular film which, there are great films, okay, but there are great films which you don't particularly want to watch a second time. Actually, I've never had the urge to rewatch Citizen Kane, for example. I mean, it is bloody long, admittedly, but Ferris Bueller's Day Off, okay, not as great a film, even though it was produced by John Hughes, who was a great ad man before he was a filmmaker. I should put that little plug in. Before he was a filmmaker, he came up with this idea of testing the quality of your razor by running a credit card along your chin. Which was a ingenious kind of, idea, a bit like the Dove litmus test. It was one of those tests, product demonstrations you can perform yourself. Really ingenious ideas. That was John Hughes of If I'm going to get into more, from the Seekers, Judith Durham and the bloke she married with the big specs who play the double bass met in the lobby of J. Walter Thompson in Melbourne as well. So there is a bit of a kind of Adland music connection, though not as big as the kind of Adland poetry or writing connection.
That makes sense.
I don't think we have the equivalent of the kind of Fay Weldons and the Salman Rushdies and the, quite in the same numbers at least. But I mean, maybe I just don't know. There's an interesting thing with films, which is films which, even though you own the film already on DVD and you've got a pitch at 9 o'clock the next morning and it's 11:30 at night and the film's already halfway through on the telly, you still watch through to the end, even though you've seen it 3 times before and you own it and can watch it at any time. And they're about, I don't know, I guess about 20 or 30 of those films, not much more than that. And that's an interesting one with songs that bear constant repetition, I think. Songs are this is one of the reasons why putting music in an ad isn't a bad idea if you can get it right, which is it makes anything repeated inordinately more tolerable. Because hitting that with a film is really hard. In other words, hitting the repetition level with a film is demonstrably harder, I think, than it is with music. I mean, I think we can just take that as a given because lots of people will listen. I mean, I also have songs on my collection where I have 27 different versions of the same song. I have an Italian language version of the thing.
Yeah.
And also I often listen to songs to the annoyance of my children 3 times in a row. Which is, there's something there which I think makes music valuable in advertising, which is, as I said, it simply essentially sweetens the pill of repetition.
Yeah. But so when you mentioned jingles going out of fashion, is it now just the case that you just sync in advertising when using music? You just sync some kind of pop music or any style of music?
Sometimes I think they make the mistake of it's a creative team signaling their particularly eclectic music taste to other creative people.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a bit of the PJ O'Rourke school, which says when you hold a party, you should play the music that the guests at the party listened to while they were at school or university.
Yeah,
I think it's a PJ O'Rourke rule, which is they will have had more time to listen to music. They will have listened to it more frequently. It's, don't impose if you have arcane musical tastes, I'm really, really happy to chat to people with really niche musical tastes. If you're into Godspeed You Black Emperor or, Norwegian thrash metal, I can't, I'm kind of intrigued, because I want to know what's going on. But equally, if you're holding a party, in a sense, what you've got to have is your music's got to be like, is it type AO blood, AB blood, the universal donor? It's got to be something that nobody really dislikes.
Yeah.
And there are people who I would call music Nazis who are so insistent. And there's a time and a place to impose your musical tastes on other people. Don't get me wrong. I've been introduced to things I wouldn't have got to like through music Nazis. But a kind of party or social event isn't really the time or the place.
Yeah, I think that's quite difficult for some people to get their head around. And I must confess that 5 years or so ago, I probably would have. I must confess I was a musical.
Yeah, by the way, I mean, podcasts and similar are actually a very good place for that because I think people are in the mode where they want to make discoveries.
Yeah. It's the question of an atmosphere. Don't arrive at a house party. It's just a question of consideration as well. It's quite difficult if you're a bit drunk, but no one wants you to choose 40 songs in a row. It's just inconsiderate.
No, exactly. But I mean, I sympathize, because, if you want to make your event perfect, what is perfect for you is having one particular song which seems to embody something or other. And of course, all music's a bit context dependent. So I think the PJ O'Rourke rule, which is you play the music from school days or university days of the people there, or of course you default to that American thing where you play some sort of jazz. which I personally don't like. You know, there used to be classical music used to be used to signal this is posh. Okay, so if you went to a five-star hotel in the 1970s, they play classical music because it's kind of reflecting the assumed taste of your clientele. Now, it
Yeah.
doesn't reflect their taste at all. I mean, most of them probably have pretty mainstream musical tastes, but we enjoy the pretense that we're the kind of people who listen to that. And it used to be
Sophisticated.
classical. And then I noticed when I went to New York, it was always a particular kind of jazz, which, to be honest, gets a bit tiresome. I mean, you know, I've got no aversion to jazz, but in New York that can get a bit tiresome, you know, where it's the only music you're allowed to play.
Yeah.
The other music I love, because I always think that, you know, a lot of the talent a lot of the skill in music is not discovering what's great, but discover what's underrated, because the best of an underrated category is still brilliant. And so three things, if you think about it, the three most readily dismissed musical genre by far are country, gospel, and probably metal. Is that fair? So
Yeah,
they're the
I was trying to guess as you went along there, and I think I've just about managed to kind of predict what you were going to say. And yeah,
I
that
mean,
probably is it, because they're great. They're really great genres if you get into them.
if you get into
Unbelievable.
them, they're absolutely fantastic. In a sense, you know, the whole of rock and roll came from gospel, right? And what's interesting is you have this argument about Elvis, which is, did he steal black music? Well, yes, okay, right, you know, undoubtedly. But actually, what everything came from, black or white, was church music, really.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, I ended up. I discovered this partly because it's a bit of a joke. I had a colleague who's a born again Christian. We had to go on some long motoring trip that involved a lot of motoring. So, as a bit of a joke for him, I bought a Mahalia Jackson cassette because this was, you know, some decades ago. Okay, he's now a vicar. And I put this on thinking, I've got you some music, Mike, you know, to keep you company on the way. And I was listening to the Mahalia Jackson. Hold on a second. This is fantastic, right?
yeah. Really amazing music.
And funny enough, I had a friend whose dad was a complete atheist, but he listened to gospel because he said, I really like to hear people sing about something they really believe in. Um, and you know, the whole of those origins really came from the church, and it's never given any credit because it would be unfashionable to do so. Then metal always intrigues me because at the very best it's fantastic. It's just it just has user imagery, as with country and with gospel. User imagery is what makes it easy to dismiss.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it's a bit like Android phones. You know, they're dismissed not because they're worse than Apple phones, but because the user imagery of the Android user tends to be not quite as good as that of the iPhone user.
yeah. It's just a sort of inbuilt prejudice.
And it is just because gospel is shitting amazing. I mean, I was listening to Mahalia Jackson at the Newport Jazz Festival, I think 1970. They've also just released this film of Aretha Franklin
Yeah,
at that church in. If there's one thing your listeners should listen to, actually, I think if it's not on Netflix, it's probably on Amazon Prime. And it's a whole church. There's this church in South Central Los Angeles, I think, which all credit to them. Mick and Keith used to go to on Sundays when they're in LA. So I'm not even sure they aren't in the congregation for this recording. And you've got Aretha Franklin and the Southern California Community Choir and God knows what else for a whole service in this church, all filmed. And until Aretha Franklin's death, there was some dispute over the rights. So it's only come out now. And that's as amazing a sort of hour and a half or 2 hours of film a musical film as you'll ever see.
yeah. That film has been on my sort of to-do list for absolutely ages. So I need to join my listeners in because I'm a huge Aretha Franklin and a huge fan of gospel music. You know,
Yeah,
it is incredible, and you're right in saying that it's underrated.
And it's just not fashionable to give it any credit. And you sort of go, well, hold on, you know, and country likewise, which is a kind of musical form. I always like that argument about the first rock and roll song, and it's a sort of battle, I think, if I'm right, between let me get this right. There's Rocket 88 and there's Move It On Over. I think. And one of them effectively comes from country, and the other one, I suppose, comes from blues. So I'm trying to remember who sang Rocket 88. It's someone. That's about a car, and then moving on over is, of course, the hillbilly Shakespeare. I've briefly blanked on his name, as he's always known.
So Rocket 88 was on Chess Records.
That's it.
Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats.
And the Delta Cats. That's it. Excellent. Yeah. And then moving on over is, of course, oh dear, died in the back of the car. You know the guy I mean.
Move it on over.
Here we are. Oh dear. I'm going completely senile. Here we are. What's going on? I'll find it.
Del Shannon?
No, that's a different one. Maybe
Bill Haley?
He did a later version, but it's actually Hank Williams.
Hank Williams. Yeah.
Moving on over is actually Hank Williams. And essentially, if you listen to it, without destroying your... There we are. Now, essentially, it's the first rock and roll song, or possibly Rocket 88.
Yeah, I've heard about this debate before.
And so it's a really interesting one, that essentially it's a case. So there's a guy you must interview, and he's at I think it's Imperial College London or possibly UCL, and he's done a lot of work into the evolution of music. And he uses kind of evolutionary science to look at what seems to happen in music. And I'll dig out his name. He's actually Dutch. He was for a time Jerry Hall's boyfriend, which gives him a bit of extra musical credibility.
Of course.
Here we are. And he's an evolutionary thinker, and he where are we? I'll find it in a second, but I should remember his name. Armand Leroy. It's Armand I've remembered the name now, actually. And he's
Armand Leroy.
And he's plotted kind of music. And he sees, as you get in evolution, you get, long periods of relative stability and then sudden disruption, like the Cambrian explosion. And he's used the same kind of models to look at this. And what I can remember is that everything's all pretty stable. It only goes back so far. The British invasion in the US is one such kind of massive disruption. And then the other one, he traces back essentially to Walk This Way by Run DMC, which is that there was this music from, in a sense, an unwanted and slightly stigmatized genre, which just crossed over somehow. And he said, there are these strange moments you get in musical development where everything goes along essentially incrementally, and then suddenly nothing's quite the same.
That's interesting, yeah.
And so you can see all the little graphs where you see, lots and lots of parallel lines, and then it's, a bit like a lie detector test. Everything goes haywire for a time. And but I mean that's a very, very interesting thing, which is the extent to which the extent to which music is always syncretic to a degree, I think, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
it has to be. Simply because if you produce something too weird and different, it's very much like, I suppose it's very much like design. Raymond Loewy used to have this thing in design, which is you have to have as much innovation as possible without making the thing unrecognizable to the user. And there's a wonderful story of Raymond Loewy in design where he manages to use the scientist to produce a fan that's almost completely silent. So it's a fan to use in hot weather. Cools you down fantastically, but it's almost completely silent, and nobody wanted it. And he realized that actually without any noise at all, somehow the cooling effect doesn't work, that we've learnt to need the noise of the fan to feel that the fan's doing its job. And we somehow just came to think that this fan was ineffectual, despite the fact that when everything was measured objectively, it was doing a perfectly good job of cooling. Because it wasn't making any noise, we basically didn't believe we were being cooled down. And I suppose musical innovation is similar. You've got to have enough recognizable material to allow people to navigate. So as a result, it has to be a kind of evolutionary process for the most part.
Especially, well, yeah, to be popular. That's fascinating and so true. You can't just move from.
You can't suddenly just reshape. I mean, we can learn to get into Indian music, I'm sure, but it would take us a bit of an effort, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and it's not going to end up in the top 40.
No, it would be very, very difficult. That was one, by the way, which always interested me, which is the Bangla hit, which the only reason I thought of it is my children started playing it 3 days ago, by Apache Indian, right?
Yeah.
Called the Boom. Now, I thought that was on the way to giving rise to a kind of new musical genre, which kind of fused, it was kind of, Anglo-Indian in its, fusion of forms.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it never seemed to go anywhere.
Never took off. For whatever reason, maybe just not enough good records of that style.
Or not enough people to produce the critical mass or whatever it might have been. Yeah, isn't that weird?
Yeah. It could have just been one of those anomalies, one of those crazes. And that kind of brings me to what I wanted to finish on, which was, talking about your book, which I would encourage my listeners to buy, Alchemy,
thank you very much.
The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. Why did you decide to write it? How did you write it? And it's such an interesting subject to write on. How did you assimilate all the examples for the book? What made you think of it in the first place?
I'm grateful to my wife for the slightly weird structure of the book, which is lots of very short chapters, which makes it, if I want to plug it, it's a perfectly good toilet read. You don't have to read the thing in 1 or 2 sittings. Okay. But that's partly because I've spent all my life either writing advertising copy or writing for The Spectator or other magazines, 600 words, 400 words, etc. So really, really large-scale structure is not my forte. And I actually realized, you could argue, there's the whole album argument, isn't there? Do you need to have a pretentious bloody album, or can you just produce 5 great songs, so it is a collection of, not quite a collection of singles, it's a thematic collection of singles in that sense, which is all about the fact that we essentially, our assumption that we actually react to the world as it objectively is, causes, I think, a monumental misdirection of effort. Because what we're trying to do is on the assumption that humans operate through a kind of Newtonian physics, where there are laws of human behavior into a kind of physical framework. Okay, and the love of kind of manufactured certainty and the lack of ambiguity that this generates causes people, I think, television is a complete piece of alchemy. The screen you're looking at right now is a complete work of alchemy because it produces only 3 colors. If you're a dog or a parrot, they'd look at your television and go, this is really shit. It doesn't even look like reality, right? Now, humans and higher primates, including, I think, gorillas, but not many higher primates, just have 3 types of cone in the eye, which produces red, green, and yellow. I got that right, haven't I? Yeah. Sorry, red. I got that completely wrong. It's red, blue, and yellow, isn't it? Red, blue, green. Sorry, red, blue, green.
Red, blue, green.
It's RBG, yeah. And with those 3 colors, by varying the relative strengths of those 3 colors, the human brain produces the whole range of color by effectively extrapolating from those 3 different inputs. And therefore, you replicate human perception in the television. You don't need your TV to produce yellow because red and green in equal measure can produce yellow in the brain. So there's no point in adding a 4th color to the pixel because we wouldn't notice the difference, right? And yet very little else we do is, so your television, when you bought your last big screen 4K TV, it probably didn't say optimized for higher primates on it. And it doesn't need to say that because dogs don't buy televisions. Okay. But actually you could produce a dog TV, and I think it would only need two color LCDs. It'd be very expensive, I imagine, to do the first one. But we're not even sure that dogs cognitively can fully watch television, although various people argue about that. Dolphins can watch TV, apparently. Dolphins can, oh, look at that, that's interesting. But the interesting thing there is that what we do is we try and do things like make trains faster, okay, on the assumption that what benefits humanity is a reduction in journey time. And my argument, this is how I accidentally became famous, was making a joke on TED, which is you don't need high speed 2, or you don't need to spend 6 billion on the Eurostar between London and Paris, making the journey to 2 hours 30 rather than 3 hours 05. Why not spend 6 billion on Wi-Fi on the train and make the journey useful or change the experience? So that in many cases, we're trying to change objective, measurable physical reality. And that's what engineers love to do. When actually changing the content, and I jokingly said, look, with 1 billion, you could bank 5 billion in savings, employ all of the world's top male and female supermodels to walk up and down the train, giving everybody free Chateau Petrus for the whole duration of the journey. You would have saved yourself 5 billion quid, and everybody would ask for the train to be slowed down, right? So why it is that we spend all this time trying to optimize the world for engineers when we could be actually optimizing the world using human metrics instead.
That's a very good point.
My argument is that advertising and marketing, and the book starts with a story about Red Bull, making the point that no rational person would say, well, we want to compete with Coca-Cola, we want to launch a really successful drink. I know, let's make it really expensive, come in a tiny can and taste kind of disgusting, right? There's no rationale behind Red Bull at all. It's an accidental emotional discovery into human preference and taste.
Yeah.
And so musicians, of course, are entirely in the same field as what you might call marketing, advertising, and, because, I mean, it's an interesting one because it's also interesting because I think music is a weird mixture of professionals and complete amateurs, and sometimes the amateurs do a better job.
Do better, yeah.
None of the Beatles could read music. Am I right?
Yeah, none of them could.
None of them could actually read at all. Did they ever learn? Did they ever bother? I suppose.
No, Paul McCartney still can't.
Yeah, you'd think, wouldn't you? They would have thought.
Most successful of all time, composer.
You would think, wouldn't you? God, at the age of 50, you would have thought it's about time I got this new notation thing sussed. But no, still can't. Okay.
No need.
There's a really mischievous one about. This is a really mischievous thought to end on. I've often worried whether there's actually, unfortunately, a benign relationship between composing ability and nicotine consumption. Because if you look at the number of great composers who are non-smokers, okay, it's unbelievably small. Yeah. I've often just wondered about that because I find it very difficult to write prose without vaping or smoking. I've just always wondered.
It's personality type, I guess, isn't it?
It might be.
If you're enjoying the Greatest Music of All Time podcast, you can keep up to date with all of our latest episodes for free by subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, the subscribe button is located at the top of the Tom Cridland YouTube page. It's also at the bottom right of any video that you watch on YouTube. If you're listening on an audio platform, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe at the top of the page.